Rising prescription drug prices have become a major policy concern in the United States, particularly regarding affordability, access, and long-term sustainability. One widely discussed solution is the use of price ceilings, legal limits on how much firms can charge, of course. However, economic theory suggests that while ceilings may lower prices, they can also reduce supply or weaken incentives for innovation. Our goal today is to evaluate whether price ceilings meaningfully change drug price inflation dynamics using time series econometric analysis of US data. We will examine the evidence and propose a policy path grounded in empirical results.
The core economic question is whether price ceilings meaningfully change inflation dynamics in the prescription drug market. Rather than looking only at overall levels of prices, we examine the rate at which prices are growing, because policy typically affects growth rates before it affects overall levels. Using the time series analysis, we studied decades of monthly data to determine whether drug price inflation declined significantly after policy changes around 2022. Our goal was to separate normal fluctuations from statistically meaningful change.
This graph here shows the consumer price index for prescription drugs from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. We access the data through the Federal Reserve's database, which provides official government statistics. As we can see, drug prices have increased steadily over time. This creates serious affordability concerns, especially for low-income and elderly households. One proposed solution is a drug price ceiling, a legal maximum price that firms are allowed to charge. In theory, this could make drug prices more affordable. However, economic theory also tells us that price ceilings can create affordable trade-offs. If prices are forced too low, firms may reduce supply or invest less in research and development. So the key question becomes, do price ceilings actually work on slowing down price growth in practice, or do prices continue rising despite policy? That is what we'll test using this data.
This slide shows the basic economic trade-off behind price ceilings using a standard supply and demand model. When the government sets a price ceiling below the market price, drugs become more affordable, which is the main benefit. More consumers want to buy at the lower price. However, at the same lower price, producers are willing to supply fewer drugs. The result is a shortage, where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. In the pharmaceutical market, this shortage may not always show up as empty shelves, but it can appear as delayed access, fewer new drugs being developed, or reduced investment in research and innovation. This is why economists say price ceilings involve a trade-off. They improve affordability in the short run, but may reduce supply or innovation in the long run. Our next step is to test whether these theoretical effects show up in real data, specifically whether price ceilings actually slow down drug price inflation.
To move beyond theory, we asked a clear empirical question. Did policy changes around 2022 actually reduce the drug inflation? First, we converted the price index into inflation using a log transformation and first differencing. This allowed us to study percentage growth rates instead of raw prices. Second, we ran an autocorrelation analysis to see whether inflation has persistence, meaning whether inflation tends to continue into the next period. And third, we conducted a Welsh mean comparison to test statistically and compare the average inflation before and after 2022. Finally, we estimated a AR1 time series regression model with a post-2022 dummy variable to test whether inflation dynamics shifted in a statistically meaningful way. This combination allowed us to test both simple average changes and a deeper structural changes in inflation behavior.
This graph shows monthly prescription drug inflation, calculated using official data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics through the FRED database. Instead of analyzing price levels, we transformed the index using a logarithm and took the first difference. This gives us the monthly percentage change, which is inflation. This step is important because policy typically affects the rate at which prices grow, not the price level immediately. If a reform works, we would expect inflation to slow down at first before prices ever fall. The graph appears volatile because it shows short-term monthly changes, small movements creating visible spikes. That volatility is normal in high-frequency data. By measuring inflation this way, we can test whether policy changed the speed of price growth, which is the key economic question.
This graph shows the 12-month moving average of prescription drug inflation using official data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics accessed through the Federal Reserve's database. We used a 12-month moving average to smooth out the short-term volatility and highlight underlying trends. Instead of focusing on monthly spikes, this allowed us to see broader shifts in inflation behavior. Looking at the graph, we observed that inflation declines after 2022. On the surface, this might suggest that policy changes were effective. However, when we tested this statistically, using both Welsh mean comparison and AR1 time series regression, the decline was not strong enough to confidently attribute it solely to policy changes. In other words, inflation fell, but the evidence does not allow us to say with high certainty that policy caused the drop. Additionally, our autocorrelation analysis and regression results show that inflation is persistent. This means that when inflation rises, it tends to continue for some time after adjusting. Economically, this suggests that price ceilings may contribute to slowing inflation, but they do not appear to fundamentally break the momentum of price growth on their own. Broader structural factors likely also play an important role.
One of the most important findings is that inflation has momentum. In economics, this is widely documented and is known as inflation inertia, the idea that once inflation rises, it tends to persist rather than disappear immediately. Our data confirms this pattern. The autocorrelation analysis showed that inflation in 1 month is strongly related to inflation in the previous month. In our AR1 regression model, the lagged inflation term was highly statistically significant, meaning past inflation helps predict current inflation. Economically, this means price growth has inertia. If prices begin rising quickly, that trend tends to continue for some time before slowing down. This is important when evaluating price ceilings. If a policy is introduced, we should not expect inflation to drop instantly. The existing momentum in price growth may delay the visible effects. Therefore, when we observe that inflation declined after 2022, but not dramatically, inflation inertia helps explain why the change was gradual rather than immediate.
This graph compares two official data series from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, accessed through the Federal Reserve's database. The blue line shows consumer drug inflation, the prices patients actually pay, measured by the Consumer Price Index. The orange line, however, shows the pharmaceutical producer's price inflation, the prices producers charge, measured by the Producer Price Index. If drug prices were driven purely by production costs, we would expect these two lines to move very closely together. However, the graph shows that they do not perfectly track each other. Producer prices are often more volatile, and consumer prices follow a smoother, different pattern. This is important for our analysis because it suggests that consumer drug inflation is not determined solely by production costs. Market structure, insurance systems, negotiations, and public policy may also influence the final prices of that consumers face. In other words, there is room for policy to matter. If consumer prices were mechanically tied to producer costs, policy would have limited influence. The divergence between CPI and PPI suggests that pricing dynamics are more complex.
To analyze this more rigorously, we use regression analysis. In general, regression estimates how one variable is related to another while holding other factors constant. It helps us determine whether patterns we observe are statistically meaningful rather than random. Specifically, we estimated an AR1 time series regression. AR stands for autoregressive, and 1 means we included one lag of inflation. In simple terms, this tests whether inflation today depends on inflation last month. We included a dummy variable for the post-2022 period. A dummy variable takes the value 0 before 2022 and 1 after 2022. When it equates to 0, it has no effect on the regression. When it equals 1, it shifts the estimated inflation level by a certain amount. This allows us to test whether inflation systematically changed after policy reforms. The result showed that inflation persistence is strong and statistically significant. Past inflation strongly predicts current inflation, confirming an inflation inertia. Although inflation is lower in the post-2022 period, the dummy variable is not statistically strong enough to confidently attribute that decline solely to policy. This suggests that price ceilings may contribute to slower inflation, but they do not appear to fundamentally break the inflation momentum on their own.
This slide summarizes our full econometric results. First, average inflation fell from 0.323% before 2022 to 0.203% after 2022. However, the Welsh test gives a p-value of 0.69, meaning that the decline is not statistically significant at the 5% level. Second, autocorrelation at lag 1 is 0.457%, showing strong inflation persistence. Meaning that inflation today is strongly related to inflation last month. In our AR1 regression, the lagged inflation coefficient is highly significant, confirming inflation inertia. The post-2022 dummy is negative, but not statistically relevant. So inflation did decline, but evidence does not allow us to confidently attribute that decline solely to policy. Momentum remains strong. And as we can see here is the results.
We found that inflation has inertia, meaning price growth continues once it starts. That suggests temporary price controls may not be enough to structurally change inflation dynamics. Academic research in health economics shows that generic entry significantly reduces drug prices once patents expire. Studies by Frank and Salkever and others show that when multiple generic firms enter, prices can fall dramatically due to increased competition. Unlike price ceilings, which restrict price directly, competition works by increasing supply and reducing market power. This directly addresses the structural forces behind inflation. Given our finding that consumer prices do not perfectly track producer costs, market structure clearly plays a role. Encouraging generic competition may therefore be more effective in breaking long-run inflation momentum than ceilings alone.
Based on our analysis, price ceilings may help to reduce inflation in the short run. We do observe low inflation after 2022. But our key econometric finding is that inflation has inertia. Inflation today strongly depends on inflation yesterday. That means that a price cap by itself is unlikely to quickly break the momentum of price growth. So we weighed 3 complementary approaches that match what we found in the data. The first one is generic and biosimilar competition. This directly increases supply and reduces market power. Academic health and economics research shows that prices fall substantially when multiple generics enter, making this a strong, long-run anti-inflation tool. Second is negotiated pricing frameworks. These target high-cost drugs where pricing power is strongest, which matters because our CPI versus PPI comparison suggests that consumer prices are not only driven by production costs. Institutions and bargaining matters. Third is targeted subsidies. These improve access and equity immediately without distorting the entire market, which helps avoid the shortage risk from strict caps. The takeaway is, ceilings can help with affordability, but to change inflation dynamics substantially, policies should also change market structure and bargaining power.
Our recommendation is a layered policy package. Step 1. Use targeted negotiation for the highest cost, most inelastic drugs, where competition is weak and pricing power is high. Step 2. Accelerate generic and biosimilar entry by reducing regulatory and legal barriers because competition is the strongest long-run mechanism for lowering prices and limiting future inflation. Step 3. Protect vulnerable patients with targeted subsidies or caps on out-of-pocket spending, so affordability improves immediately without creating broad shortages. This approach fits our evidence since inflation shows inertia, structural competition and bargaining reforms are needed to sustainably reduce inflation, while targeted support protects equity today. In short, price ceilings can be a tool, but the path forward is negotiation, competition, and targeted protection. And these are our sources.
Thank you.